welcome Ree and welcome David. In your hands. And welcome Catherine.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So through this report, we're really addressing the issue of refined and consolidated SHA establishment criteria. The committee's not being asked to adopt new criteria. It's being asked to consider a proposed refinement and consolidation of the existing criteria into a single document. That being the original criteria and the additional considerations that were agreed to by the Auckland Development Committee in April of this year. The result of this doesn't change the overall threshold for support of an SHA proposal. What it does do, what it aims to do, and we think it will do, is make the criteria more user-friendly and allow the public and interested parties to better understand our process and the way in which we reach decisions on SHA requests. The guidance explains when the Council is unlikely to recommend that a piece of land or groups of parcels of land become an SHA. Attachment C in the report provides the new format in relation to the previous format. So it shows that transition from the existing criteria to the proposed new expression of those criteria. Attachment D of the report is the version of the new refined and consolidated criteria that we would use for communication purposes, and that will go on the website and be conveyed to interested parties following its adoption by the governing body on the 24th of this month. In attachment C and D, you'll see that there's a colour coding that distinguishes the different responses to questions against the criteria, where green means the answer to the criterion question means support for the SHA proposal is likely. Orange means the answer to the criterion question means that we may not support the SHA proposal, and there could be potential concern for more, or potential concerns or more information that may be required to reach a final decision. Red means the answer to the criterion question is that the area is either not appropriate for an SHA or is unlikely to be supported, or unlikely to be appropriate for an SHA at this time, or the time it's being assessed. Now, the Minister of Building and Housing must be satisfied, particularly in relation to matters in criteria 1 to 3, because those are the matters that are expressly required under the Housing Accords and Special Housing Areas Act. We must be able to indicate through our recommendations that those criteria can be met. Therefore, a red answer to any of those particular criteria questions mean the Council is very unlikely to be able to support a proposal. The report also asks you to consider a couple of process changes. One is that the ADC exercise its existing delegated authority to recommend SHAs directly to the Minister of Building and Housing. That takes away one step in the process, which would be an efficiency gain. That's in Resolution J of the report. Resolution K relates to the committee being asked to agree that the Housing Project Office may decide not to refer to the committee for consideration SHA requests that do not satisfy those mandatory criteria in 1 to 3. So again, an efficiency gain. The purpose of that resolution is to avoid the ADC having to consider requests that could not become SHAs because information does not satisfy the mandatory considerations under section 16.3 of the Act. We're also informing you that in relation to iwi views, which are already a criteria 11, that we are interested in as part of our normal due diligence process, just that from this point forward we're intending to advise mana whenua about SHA requests as an additional safeguard to ensure we don't miss any key pieces of information in our assessment. We would only do that in relation to sites that have already passed our initial screening and have a real potential to go forward as recommendations. We don't want to flood anyone, mana whenua included, with irrelevant information. So there's a couple of slightly amended resolutions which Tam has and are already up. One relates to Clause E, or Recommendation E, which is really just making a bit more explicit that the committee would refer these amended criteria, refined and consolidated criteria, to the governing body on the 24th for its endorsement. And Resolution H, which just proposes an addition to that, having taken into account the criteria and any other relevant matters, so that's a little bit more clear what the intent of that clause was. I just want to, Mr. Chair, I might take some guidance here, because in the workshop we had yesterday there were suggestions around how we deal with the issue of employment, and I'd be quite keen just to explain how we already deal with that. I can do it now, or I can do it later when that item comes up.
Feel free to, you know about it from yesterday,
yes.
So feel free to expand now.
All right, so we think it's a very important matter, and we note that it's been brought up, you know, for that reason. But what I'd just like to say is that it's already, in our view, covered in the existing criteria in the form of the location consideration, which explicitly references access to employment as one of those considerations. In the refined and consolidated criteria, we'll see criterion 4 on page 31 of your agenda report. Strategic location is one of the considerations, and one of the sub-elements of that is sites may be considered strategic if they are in proximity to major existing or emerging employment areas. Also criterion 9, quality of development and compatibility with the PORP. We consider that proximity to employment is already embedded to a significant extent in the development strategy and the pattern of zoning and the proposed unitary plan, such that you'll tend to find high density residential zones in places that are closer to major employment areas. So we do already look at it. We're also interested in any changes to proposed future employment patterns, and we monitor that on an ongoing basis as part of our forward land infrastructure program and analysis. And that would also be embedded in things like changes to employment forecasts that come through our statistical analysis and our REMU team. If employment opportunities were considered to be part of any of the above, then the council would obviously consider that as an important part of our assessment of any particular SHA request. And because the criteria are non-exhaustive, as indicated in the resolution recommendations in the report, it means that if there's some other matter that's raised by any party, such as employment proximity, we can consider it even if it's not explicit in the recommendations, in the criteria. If we were to make it a more detailed recommendation, we would have to look at how we would actually measure proximity to employment, but obviously we'll take guidance based on the committee's decision in this regard. The only other thing I want to say is that the implementation of this, if the committee agrees to these refined and consolidated criteria, as I said, this attachment D would go onto the council's website, and we will communicate it to interested parties. And subject to the governing body endorsement on the 24th, we would use the refined and consolidated criteria in future recommendations about SHA requests following that date.
Thank you, David. Catherine, do you have anything to add in terms of the oversight that Legal's had on this quite important document? Do you want to just give us a flavour of how this has been examined by your office and possibly others to ensure that it complies with the legislation, etc.?
Legal Services has been closely involved, worked very closely with HPO in the refinement of these criteria, bringing them together, and we've had external legal advice as well, just to make sure that we've got everything as right as can be in relation to legislation, which leaves great areas opaque, but to try and help the council give clear signals to manage expectations out in the community in this last year of the special housing area process.
Thank you. Rhea, is there anything further to add?
No, Mr Chair, happy to answer questions.
So just before we go to the questions, members, can we just, we'll just scroll through the changes. So we'll go to the top.
Can you move it?
Yeah, I will move it, but there might be some changes. I'll move, do I have a second?
Cooper.
Councillor Cooper, thank you. Can we just go to the top, and now I'll just go back to David's presentation points. There was a change in the E. Let's just go to the E because it's not highlighted. Let's just highlight, can you just highlight those words again, David, that are the changes in E?
Yeah, the new words are be referred for endorsement to the governing body, whereas previously it said attachment D, endorse by the governing body and applied. So it's just a little bit more
Let's
direct.
just highlight that in red so we can all understand, because no doubt members have read their agenda, so I just want to make it really clear that
So the new
what you're
wording
voting on has got some small changes. Okay, members, it's still got to be further endorsed. And then we'll go down to H, I think it is. Clear on that one, members? And then we'll go further down. And the K.
So that was suggested, but we're not specifically recommending that. That was considered as a possible enhancement, but I think the advice that we've received is that not actually necessary.
Okay, members, I'm just highlighting that for you, just to test that with you if there's any concern in that area. So if you just read K again and what K implies, I'm just putting that up there as a possibility. It's,
Mr Chairman.
if there is a not a desire to have that, we can take it out.
Mr.
And now
Chairman,
take questions.
Yeah, just while we're on that particular K, I would be more comfortable if that was in consultation with the chair and deputy chair, rather.
Yeah. Yeah.
Chair.
Yes.
And because I think that allows for
yes.
for a degree of debate.
Yeah.
And
Great.
around that. So I'd rather have and rather than or.
Yeah.
Good point, thank you. And I didn't notice that. Thank you. I have a question from Councillor Webster, I think, first, and then Councillor and I.
Yes, thank you for this criteria. My concern is defining adequate infrastructure. And we all know what we're talking about, I'm sure. Adequate in whose mind, and it also probably goes to the local board input because I've lost the page, hang on. Under 10, views of local board, iwi and landowners, there's no sort of ability for local boards to object because of inadequate infrastructure. And I just wonder if, well, could you answer probably what adequate infrastructure is? And I'm very concerned, as you know, about the transport side of it.
Through Mr Chair, ultimately the council laws on the recommendations of staff have to be satisfied that there is adequate infrastructure or that there is likely to be a program of work to enable that infrastructure to be provided over time. So we have seen more recently, for example, with the Huapai Triangle SHAs, with the council's decision to approve a local residential growth fund, that we can enter into infrastructure agreements with the developers who can forward fund and be reimbursed for development contributions. So while the works weren't provided for at the outset, there was an indication that we could work with those developers and enter into agreements so that those works could be provided and serve that particular SHA. And as you're aware, Councillor Webster, they do refer to transport matters. So that is always going to be a judgment, and there is a range of infrastructure readiness that needs to be considered. We've outlined in the report that range of infrastructure, and then you have to have an overall decision in terms of balancing that out in terms of the need for housing.
So further to that, Mr. Chairman, with your indulgence, I mean, we have a new issue that seems to be moving into the whole SHA area, and that is threats of judicial review, you know, if we turn things down, and we've already had one case of that, and I know there's another one possibly pending. Maybe Catherine would like to comment on, you know, our ability to cope with those sorts of situations, because it seems to me the pressure comes on, and that's why if we're not sure what adequate infrastructure means, adequate to the developers or to somebody or even staff may not be adequate to councillors or local board members.
I agree entirely with the comment from Ree that you as decision makers are the people who have to be satisfied on the adequacy point. So information will come to you and you form a view as to whether you think it's adequate. Taking advice as to what's the relevant parameters and time frame that you might be considering that question. In terms of your point around judicial review, there's nothing the council can do to prevent somebody bringing a legal challenge. What we can do is make sure that we're in as robust a position as we can to defend that. And from our experience from the one matter that you're referring to, what we're looking at is a very close working relationship between legal and HBO and the advice that's coming through to you in relation to recommendations and as to how to proceed and how to calibrate the decision making as to whether those mandatory requirements are not met. So what we're looking at in basic terms is judicial review proofing as best we can the entire process from the beginning through to decision making.